I could tell right away that this was going to be a pretty good book. Much like a lot of other pieces of classic literature, there is a little bit of a preface before actually going into the book. And I found it rather fascinating in all honesty. The book took the author 20 years to write, and he never thought he would actually be able to finish it. And what's rather fascinating is, at least according to the preface, is because the book took so many years, you can kind of see the author's stance on certain issues changing over time. And that's not something I've heard happening very often. And in a ways, I almost have to laugh a little bit. So, the last book I read that was just as long as this was Gone with the Wind. And wouldn't you know that Gone with the Wind does reference Les Misérables. According to that book, this story was very well loved in the Confederate Army and was later nicknamed Les Miserables. In fact, we even see Melanie reading several chapters of this book to see if a meeting of the clan was going to be chopped up or whatnot. I want to keep it kind of vague in case you want to read Gone with the Wind, but that's the basic story, and I always kind of took that as well. This book is gigantic. That must have taken forever, but no. Even though this book is quite a mammoth collection, the average chapter is maybe like 5 pages. So even though it looks intimidating, it's actually not that intimidating to read. And for those of you wondering why it's taken me so long to get through part 1, well, this was meant to be a bit of a distraction while I was healing up from surgery. The only issue was I did my job too well. In addition to this book, I also had a journal that I was keeping, which I later made a video of. I plowed through Tears of the Kingdom, another very long and epic story, as well as had the ability to catch up on shows that I had not seen for several years. So, while I did read the book, I had so many other things to keep me occupied that it was kind of on and off. Probably one of the fun things to mention as well is, especially given the length of this book, there's a famous story that Victor Hugo was abroad, and he wanted to know how well his book was selling. So, he wrote a letter to his publisher, simply putting on a question mark, and then sent it to him. Well, the publisher was in on the joke, and he sent back a very similar message with an exclamation point. So it's crazy that Victor Hugo is credited as writing one of the longest books, but also writing one of the shortest letters. If not the shortest. I read this out of a book of various facts, so it's hard to say if there was a letter that was even shorter than that, or if this entire story is true. The first thing that really surprised me about it, usually when there's a big epic story like this, it usually involves a war as a backdrop. Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Princess Mononoke, War and Peace, Gone with the Wind, and I figured this was going to have the French Revolution as the backdrop, but no, this takes place several years after that, and honestly filled in quite a few blanks on what I knew about French history. I'm in the United States, and basically all we were taught about the French Revolution is, well, you got the Reign of Terror by Robespierre. You got King Louis the, I want to say, 16th, which was executed, as well as his wife Marie Antoinette, who very famously said, well, let them eat cake, which I'm sure that is just as much of a myth as well as Napoleon's height. And after the monarchy was kicked out, the Emperor Napoleon stepped in. And in reading this book, it was just kind of crazy to hear that afterwards, the emperor was then disposed of on the throne, and then the king and queen came back with Louis the 17th. And then afterwards, then Napoleon came back again and then kicked them out, and somewhere along the line, a democracy was put into place, I think. I feel like I'm just going on in tangents, aren't I? Let me try to go to the actual beginning of this book. We detail the story of a bishop who is in charge of a rather modest parish in the city of, I should probably note right now, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of most of these names, Digny, I want to say. The way his life started out is he was a lawyer before the revolution, but during the revolution he was targeted as the Reign of Terror was kicking off, so he left the country, and during that exile he really came close to the Catholic faith and dedicated his life to it. And so from there he became a bishop. Now early on we really get a painting as to what kind of person this bishop is. Next door to his residence is a hospital, which the bishop is thinking, wow, this place is so small. How many people can you fit in here? That's it? I can fit more people than that in my living room. And so the bishop is like, I don't need this much space. You're the ones that need it. Why don't we just swap places? I'll take the hospital and you can take my residence. The swap is made, and both parties are satisfied. Now, being a bishop obviously entails quite a few perks. As we mentioned, the residency. But he also had two ecclesiastical sisters to act as helpers for whatever the bishop needs, as well as his own personal carriage. Well, this bishop gives away most of his money to what he considers far more important, the poor. He even sold his carriage to serve just such a purpose. He wanted to help out wherever and whenever possible, and especially to those that couldn't afford it. It was a very famous time where his faith was shaken up a fair bit. There is this very famous ex-revolutionary who is also very famously an atheist, who has been kicked out and ostracized from any sort of community. However, the bishop still wanted to give this poor man last rites. They have a conversation, which the bishop doesn't end up losing his faith from, but this man does poke quite a few holes in there that he then devotes a while into prayer as well as reading to try to figure out if this man had any truth to what he just said. Another chapter that speaks very much to the bishop's character is that it had been a while since he neglected a small mountainous region to say a mass of. There was so many people recommending that he not go to this mountainous region, as there was a group of violent bandits that were sighted in the area. However, the bishop is quite along in years and he doesn't really fear death at this point. Since he gave most of his money away to the poor, he doesn't have anything worth stealing. And on top of that, he very much believed in the power of the Almighty and that he would protect him from any sort of ill will. He goes up to say a very special funeral mass, one that was so touching that the violent group left fantastic artifacts stolen by a nearby cathedral to conduct the ceremony in probably the fanciest way possible. Now, another, according to the sisters, quirk of the bishop is that he refused to ever lock his door, as whoever was at it was going to need his help, and he just wanted him to come right in. However, the sisters were obviously a little on edge about such things, especially with the story of a very famous convict being released from prison, a man by the name of Jean Valjean. I get the feeling I'm probably putting way too much of an accent on it, but this man has been let out of prison, With his working papers saying that he paid off his debt to society and he's a free man, he realizes that those papers are nothing but a curse. No matter where he tries to go, he's immediately kicked out for being a violent criminal. He has money. He has the ability to be able to pay for lodging, pay for meals, but nobody wants him there. So, with no lodging he can stay at, he starts knocking on doors, seeing if he can find a place to stay or even some food to eat. But unfortunately, the grapevine has told everybody that this is the man, keep a lookout for him. Do not let him in. He is armed and dangerous. With no other option left, he goes into a dog kennel to try and sleep. However, that only lasts for all of about 30 minutes, as the dogs don't really like him there either, and they kick him out. Last option, a park bench. He is starving, but he figures that maybe sleep will make it so he doesn't feel the hunger anymore. As he's getting ready on a park bench, there's this old woman that approaches him saying, "What are you doing on this park bench?" "I'm trying to sleep here. What's it look like I'm doing?" "Oh, well, I mean, there's so many other inns you can go to. I'm not wanted there." And so the old woman is like, "You know what? There is probably one other place you would be welcome. The bishop's place." Which I probably should mention that the bishop had also been given the nickname of the welcome bishop. And I don't mean like the thank you, you're welcome sort of welcome. More like the welcome, come on in sort of welcome. It's in French, so I'm not really sure how to pronounce it. But regardless, the two sisters are really having it out with the bishop, saying, there's this deadly criminal coming around. You need to get a lock on that door, monsieur. However, the bishop is like, you know why I don't put locks on doors. Whoever's at it, they're going to need my help. All right, but at least make it so whenever somebody knocks on the door, don't just immediately say, come in. And then all of a sudden, there's a knock at the door. To which the bishop just turns around and says, come in. The sisters are immediately mortified, as this man fits the description of the convict. However, the bishop doesn't care. He sees him as another poor soul that needs help. He then instructs the two sisters to set another place for this poor man to eat, and even gives him a place to sleep. However, Jean is just like, you realize I'm a violent criminal, right? I could rob you in the night, or I could even kill you. And the bishop is like, yes, you could do that, but you are a poor man in need of help, and I'm going to give you that help. At dinner is when we get more of a story as to how Jean ended up like this. Jean only ever knew poverty. As such, he was never really given much of an education, and the only occupation that he could muster was a professional pruner. The only relative he really had left was his sister, who with her husband married and had 7 kids. Well, after the husband died, he assumed the responsibilities of getting bread on that table. Now, as you'd imagine, on a pruner's salary, that was a very difficult thing to do, but he was able to make ends meet, just barely. But the youngest making sure to get the bigger portion of bread off of that table. Well, it was a slow season, and the French countryside had no need for a pruner. Jean was desperate, and so he went to a local bakery and attempted to steal a loaf of bread. He was originally given a sentence of 5 years for this robbery. However, he always kept trying to escape, not only to see how his family was doing, or more accurately his sister's family, but also he felt very much wronged by this experience. He was starving, and that was the only way he was going to be able to eat anything, or anyone in that family was going to be able to eat anything. So, through all the multiple escaped attempts, his sentence ended up going around for 15 years. During that time, didn't have much else to do, so he figured he'd make a little something of himself. He tried to work out, so that way he was physically strong, but also mentally strong, as the prison system did give a fair bit of schooling, and much better schooling than the poor Jean had many years prior. When he got out, he had nothing but resentment for the human race, and he wanted nothing more than to give all his revenge to the people that did him wrong. However, the bishop, much like a candle in the distance, was a light to the world that he thought had completely gone out. All of a sudden, he realized that people can be kind. And this gives him quite the predicament in his mind, trying to figure out what is good and what is evil. Was he in the wrong, or was everybody else wrong? This was one of the major thoughts that he had while he was sleeping in the bishop's bed. When he awoke, he found that it was probably the most restful night's sleep he ever had, as he was used to sleeping on wood with a stone pillow. However, he still very much had that bitterness against the world. And so, Jean went to the table and stole the finest silver. The sisters the next day go up to the bishop and they're just like, how in the world could you allow him to do such a thing? However, the bishop just simply says that silver was for the poor, and there was no poorer man than that pitiful creature. There is another knock at the door, which the bishop says, come in. It is the police, saying that they caught Jean Valjean with the silver. The bishop smothers this over, basically saying, oh, when you took that, you forgot to take the candlesticks with you. That should hopefully be enough for you to get started. The charges are dropped when the bishop leans over to Jean as the police are walking out, saying, remember, this silver is to buy your soul back from the devil. Use it only for good, not for evil. And so, once again, Jean is in this conflict of the soul. He knew from that day on he was either going to be the greatest saint or the greatest monster on this planet. He is once again sitting at a park bench trying to figure out what to do with the silver, as a local chimney sweep has a coin in his hands that he keeps flipping up and down, enjoying his day's pay. Well, the coin lands on Jean's foot and he steps on it. The chimney sweep keeps saying, hey, mister, give me my coin back, but the whole time he's just like, could I be the monster? Could I be the saint? I mean, the world was just so cruel to me. I want them to suffer, but maybe, sir, could you give me my coin back? I just don't know what to do. And the whole time he was just going back and forth in his mind while the chimney sweep was just like, lift your leg, I need my pay. After a while, the chimney sweep just gave up and he walked away. Once Jean comes back to his senses, he lifts his foot and he's like, where'd this come from? Maybe this is a sign that I can be a good person. And so he puts that in his bag with the candlesticks, and he goes off to try to figure out how to be that just and saintly man. From there, the book jumps to the year 1817, and as I mentioned earlier in my little breakdown of French history, if you're actually French, feel free to correct me, as I get the feeling I probably get some details really mixed up. But this is after the time Napoleon was replaced with King Louis XVII, an era where the sanity was becoming insanity. But this is really just more of a backdrop, as we're just focusing on 4 pairs of people. There was only really one that is worthwhile, but I'm going to attempt to say the others' names. I have it written down here, so let me see. So there's 4 women, so you got Fantine, Favorite, Zéphine, and Dahlia. I hope I'm saying that right. And then you also have the 4 boyfriends, Blacheville, Famiel, Listolier, and Tholimis. I get the feeling I'm gonna be saying this so horribly. I apologize for all French speakers because I know I'm completely butchering this. But Hey, give me some slack. At least I'm not calling this book Les Miserables. But anyway, this fellow mice, I hope I'm saying his name right, reminds me a lot of Gringor from The Hunchback of Notre Dame, as he's a character that just has a lot to say and nobody cares. In fact, if I were to go even further back, reminds me a lot of the Wife of Bath from Geoffrey Chaucer's immortal book, The Canterbury Tales. It's impressive, but as you're reading through it, I'm just kind of like, wow, this guy is such a windbag. I can't tell if this is really speaking to his character or if the author is wasting my time. I'd say it really speaks to the character, is he thinks he's so smart, he has all these philosophical insights that everybody must know about. It is a nice summer. All of them are just enjoying a nice walk out with their boyfriend slash girlfriend. It's one gigantic group date. And the evening ends with all of them going together for a nice meal at a restaurant, with the boys saying that they have a very nice surprise in store for the girls. Well, the girls are definitely chatting away, trying to figure out, I wonder what the surprise is. Do you think they're going to propose marriage? Maybe they got flowers for us. Or perhaps they might be taking us on a night on the town after all this fantastic stuff we've seen. Well, after enough time, the waiter comes forward with a simple notice basically saying, you know what, the time we spent together was fun, but we moved on. Goodbye. However, we have paid the pill for you, so have as much fun at our expense as possible, okay? Well, ordinarily this seems like quite the dick move on their end, but actually the guy's first name is Felix. I think I'll just call him Felix for consistency, or Tholomyes. Get the feeling I'm not pronouncing that right. He was the biggest dick of all. In fact, I am going to upgrade him from dick to dork, which for those of you wondering, a dork is a whale dick, so much bigger than the... why am I talking about dicks? Well, because this guy is one gigantic dick, because Fantine... I just know I'm going to say Fontaine at one of these points, so please bear with me. Fantine had his child for 2 years. And it's just like, oh yeah, whatever. You gotta take care of this mess that I gave you. This is 1817. A woman with a single child is basically a death sentence. She's gonna be labeled a whore, an adulteress. Nobody is gonna want to give her employment because it's just like, oh, well, what did she do to drive off the husband? Maybe she's a black widow and she killed him. Or maybe it's all these other things that it's always the woman's fault, not the man was just a butterfly, pollinated the flower, and said, yeah, I've had enough with you, I'm going to go off to the next one. However, even through all this, Fantine is a very loving mother. She tries everything in her power to get a stable job, but she's just bouncing all over the place and having no luck. As soon as they see that she's with child, she's immediately labeled a whore and is going against the family values of any business that she is trying to work for. However, there is a bit of a ray of hope. She is walking along the French countryside when she notices a group of children playing by this massive mail carriage. She then notices that there is the figure of the proud mother watching over these kids. And so she reasons that she's not going to get anywhere when she is with child and decides to drop the kid off at her doorstep. Both her, as well as the husband, agree. They both own a local tavern, and the main thing is they need money in order for this place to keep going. And hey, an extra child that could potentially work for them as well as get some extra pay, they were fully on board. The last place that Fantine had left was her hometown. Now, there's actually a bit of background to understand about this hometown. It used to be just a mere speck on the map. Some people thought that it was just a piece of dust that settled there, and if you blew it away, it would disappear. However, there was this mysterious person simply known by the name of M. Madeline. Once again, hope I'm pronouncing that right. He kind of just came out of nowhere when the town was on fire. He did everything in his power to be able to clear the fire, and from there, everybody wanted to know, okay, who is this guy? And as his passport got burned up in the fire, he just simply was labeled under the name M. Madeline. At first, the simple town was rather afraid of this man, as they really knew nothing about his background or anything. In fact, there was a local police inspector that always suspected him of being an ex-con due to his rather prestigious strength that he had. However, he was able to put in some great business savvy into the town. So, I'm not sure if people have any idea what jet is. Essentially, it's like a precious stone, and this is where we get the term jet black from, because it is a black stone that is often used in jewelry. And that was really this town's claim to fame, if you want to say it, is that they would make jewelry out of this precious stone. Well, this M. Madeline, which I think just to make it easier, I'll just call him Madeline from now on, he was able to streamline this process so that not only everybody in the town was able to have a job, was able to get good money, everything was going fantastically because he stepped in and he was able to produce more of these jet pieces of jewelry, more people were able to buy them. Everything was fantastic. This was the scene that Fantine returned to this town to. Everybody was employed at the factory, and she was no exception. She worked fantastically well. She got paid very well. And a small chunk of her earnings were going back to the mysterious couple at the inn in order to raise the child. Now, like any good story like this, there always has to be one snoopy old person that just has to ruin it for everybody. She wanted to know what in the world these mysterious letters were going into this town were all about. And she found out that it was to pay child support. Well, once word got out, she was labeled a whore, indecent, and she had to get out of town pretty quickly. In fact, even the mayor, this M. Madeline, said that you're going to ruin our reputation, you have to leave. And she would have, if not for all the debtors on her rented furniture, her apartments, and everything. And from there, she just fell right into poverty. She was able to get a little bit of a job here and there, but it was not nearly paying as much as the factory was. And so she had to move out of the apartment. She wanted to sell her furniture, but her renters wouldn't allow it. And it just kept getting worse and worse. And all the while, the couple that was taking care of her child, I didn't decide a name to her yet, Cosette, I believe. And to me, I think that is the girl that is on the cover here. But as I read further, perhaps it'll make more sense to me. So, she is just figuring out how to just live in poverty. And all along the way, she is just selling everything she can in order to keep this Cosette happy. When in actuality, the innkeepers were just all full of business, and they just wanted to get all her money. So they would often make up stories of just like, hey, you need to give us 50 sous because Cosette is sick, she needs medicine and whatnot. Oh, she ran out of clothes, you're going to need us to buy some more of it. And along the way, she was just, well, probably the worst parts I can think of is there was a local traveling dentist that came by and said she had fabulous eye teeth. She sold them to pay for Cosette to be all right. And then she completely shaved her head as a way to be able to not only get some money, but also to be able to make some more clothes for Cosette. She is just about at the bottom as the bottom can go. When there is just this local, I'm trying to figure out what the best words, I would say urchin maybe, but no, that's probably how they describe Fantine. I'll just say smart aleck. Basically, he kept making passes at Fantine. It's just like, Boy, you is ugly. Whatever happened to your front teeth? Can you see without those eye teeth? Where in the world did your hair go? Boy, you are the most hideous thing I've ever seen. Poverty had given her a strong back, and these insults meant nothing to her. That was, until this man took a snowball, opened up her dress, and then poured it right in. From there, she just completely unhinged and just attacked this man. Now, the local police chief, the one that suspected the mayor, M. Madeline, of being a convict, brought Fontaine into the prison. Just like everybody else, sees her as a common whore, and it's just like, yeah, you're going to jail for a long time for beating up such an upstanding citizen. However, M. Madeline saw the entire struggle and saw Fontaine as completely innocent. She was the one that was provoked, and she was the one that was standing up for her respect. And so M. Madeline was just like, release her. To which the police captain, forgot to give him a name, Jarvett, I want to say, he's just like, what? Release her? She did a crime. She has to pay. She's just a common whore. Release her. Now. You're serious about this? You can't be. It's not in the book. It's everything I gone against. Release the creature before I fire you. If and so Jarvett opens the door and she starts to walk away. When all of a sudden Jarvett comes to his senses and it's just like, come back here, you filthy whore. To which Aunt Madeline's just like, I told you to let her go. And Jarvett, once again, just had a conflict of the soul, just like Jean Valjean did. He just walked away in a complete state of shock. M. Madeline later caught up with the woman and wanted to try to help her out. Well, because of her disfigurement, missing teeth, completely bald, horrible complexion, as well as just having an acute case of tuberculosis, she did not look like the same woman that was fired from the factory. When he realized that it was his fault, he wanted to make it right. He said that he was going to pay for the child care. He was going to pay off all the debtors, and he was going to nurse her back to health. It was at that point that Fontaine's health just completely let out and she dropped. When she woke up, she found herself in the care of a whole bunch of nuns, with the mysterious M. Madeline coming in to keep praying for her well-being as well as for all this other stuff that happened. She seemed to be doing all right, but all the while she wanted to know what was happening to her poor Cosette. There's no R. M. Madeline tried all his money to be able to get this Cosette free, but these innkeepers were like, what? No, there's no way we're going to get rid of our biggest cash cow. We're making so much money on her. We're not giving her back. And all along the way, Fontaine kind of faded in and out of good health. Now, there's a rather interesting thing here. So, we get like little bits and pieces as to who this M. Madeline might be. The biggest glimpse we get is that when the famous Bishop of Digny died, he was one of the few that showed up at his funeral. And then just out of the blue, Victor Hugo's just like, and the reader might have guessed that this mayor is actually Jean Valjean. Am I this dense? I did not see that twist coming. It's just, that's like the equivalent of, well, actually, if I give an equivalent, it's going to spoil any major story, but just the idea that the author's just like, oh yeah, that's Jean Valjean. What? It was one of those things that's like filled in the pieces of the puzzle, but it was just insane how he just dropped it like it was so obvious, but yet I didn't see it coming. I was personally shocked by it. But the main reason that this was brought up is that Jarvett, the police captain, had been chasing after this Jean Valjean, and he was satisfied when a very mysterious priest was arrested for stealing an apple branch. let me see if I can get this guy's name for you. I'm gonna assume it's pronounced Champ Matthew offhand. Which Jarvis was just like, oh, you see, if you just move the letters around, it spells Jean Valjean, which kind of lines up to what the guy's original name was, but because he was just a pauper, the records were not kept very well, and not only that, he looks exactly like it. This is obviously the Jean Valjean. Well, and Madeline, or perhaps I should just say the real Jean Valjean. I think I'll just refer to him as the mayor for the moment. So, the mayor is once again in a bit of a crisis. Either he takes the stand to make sure that this innocent person doesn't go to jail for the rest of his life and then puts himself in jail at the same time. However, in doing so, he's basically guaranteeing the death of Fantine and Cosette. All along the way, he's just going back and forth, trying to figure out what is the best choice. However, when he left the Bishop of Dagny, he said that he wanted to become the great saint and not the great monster. And so, he makes plans to go to that trial. He tries everything he can. He gets the fastest horse, he gets the fastest carriage, he drives the fastest route possible, only for him to just barely graze into a mail wagon which destroys the carriage. He is in a local town trying to figure out how to be able to get to the trial in time. However, the wheelmaker said that this job would take at least 3 days, and by then the trial would be over. However, the mayor kind of saw this as like, oh, it's divine providence. Perhaps I don't have to pay for this. I could just go on living my fantastic life where I am loved, I am wealthy. I don't have to sleep on wood anymore with a stone pillow. But of course, this was a subject that was brought out in the open, and there was a local couple that, well, in a manner of speaking, they were helping Jean out. They got a carriage and a horse for him to be able to take the rest of the way to the trial. He showed up several hours late and was crestfallen when the bailiff said that the trial had ended 4 hours ago. Jean is part relieved, but also part feeling guilty about such a thing. And he wanted to know the details of the trial, to which the bailiff says, "But what is there? I mean, it's a pretty cut and dry case of infanticide. This woman had killed her child, and she admitted it." Infanticide? What about the case of Champ Matthew? Well, that case is still going on. They've been in there for quite a few hours. It's full now, but, well, perhaps you might be able to seek favor with the judge to sit in the special box. He seeks that special authority, and as he is there at that door, he's just like, go in, go out, what to do? Mechanically, he does open the door, and he sits in that trial. From there, he gives his testimony. As a way to try to identify this Champ Matthew, they brought in several convicts that knew Jean Valjean while they were in prison. And they were just like, yeah, that's definitely Jean, all right. To which the mayor's like, boys, how in the world do you not recognize me? I recognize you. You still got that scar on your left leg from when you lifted that boulder up over your head. And you still walk with that limp because you dropped that hammer right on your foot. As well as other details that only the real Jean Valjean could have. He gave his details. He admitted to the robbery of the silver coin from the chimney sweep as well as the candlesticks, which, as we've kind of discussed, he didn't really steal them, but he just wanted to clear this man, and he said that. And then he promptly left on the mail carriage the next day. While he was away, Fantine got the rumor that perhaps M. Madeline was going out to rescue her beloved Cosette. When he came back, he wanted to try to figure out how to break the truth to her in such a way that it wasn't going to immediately kill her. He said that he didn't really have the time go into details, but he will go for Cosette as soon as possible. That is when the police captain Jarvet walks through the door. Not only is Fantine on edge because the last time she saw him, she was going to be hauled off to jail and he refused to let her go, but it was the mayor that protected him. Jarvet comes in and is immediately like, "Come here, you dirtbag. I've been after you for so many years and you're never going to get away from me." Alright, I'll go quietly, but just on one request. Why are you whispering, you scum? Why don't you speak up so that everyone can hear you? I need a few days to go get Cosette. To which Fantine is just like, "Cosette? My Cosette? She's not here? Where in the world did she go?" And then she just immediately dropped out of a heart attack. Now this whole scene reminds me a fair bit of Schindler's List. So there's a scene where the Nazis come in and want to get rid of all of Schindler's Jewish employees, including a one-armed man that was a really good press operator. Well, as he was considered worthless, he was shot, to which Oskar Schindler just goes to the captain and is like, "You killed my best operator." And that is very much the tone I feel like M. Madeline said to Jarvet when he said, "You killed her." Basically that you can tell he's obviously ticked off, but yet it does not show on his face or his manner of speaking. It seems as if he's about to go quietly, when, as he's being taken away, he sees an old metal bed. Due to his immense strength, he immediately takes out a gigantic bar and just says, "If you know what's good for you, leave me a few minutes alone with her to make peace." What he said to her, nobody ever knew. But the nuns that were in the ward at the time swore that Fantine gave a slight smile on her face before gently passing away, even though, by all accounts, she was already dead. From there, the town went to ruin. As soon as the reputation came out that M. Madeline was a convict, everything he had must have turned to evil, and so the town returned to poverty again. Everybody lost their jobs, except for like a handful of people that still very much believe that he turned over a new leaf. And in ways, I'm reminded very much of the Fountainhead in this scene. It's very much the idea that it's pretty easy to destroy a person's reputation. All you have to do is just keep a narrative going for a few months, and then after that, people would just associate the name with an evil person. Instead of M. Madeline being the savior that put the town on the map, he was a convict that was caught stealing. And as such, no good could ever come from him again. His servants still lived their lives as if Jean Valjean would return. And surprisingly enough, he did. The main thing he wanted to do was set his affairs straight. He escaped from prison to make sure that he was able to set enough money aside for Fantine's funeral, return the candlestick and the money that he stole from the chimney sweep into evidence like he promised he was going to, and send whatever was left of his savings to the poor. Well, Fantine was once again given the reputation of being a whore, so she was given a pauper's funeral, but at least she was given a proper burial, rather than just thrown in some sort of river or something. And from there, Jean Valjean was just seen walking away with what looked like work clothes. It turned out that the factory was unlocked and he was able to get some clothes that way. And that is where part 1 of the book ends. Yeah. This is a very good book. I will admit, there is a part of me that wishes I didn't relate so much to the character of Jean Valjean. Well, just kind of going back to my earlier life. When I was a kid in elementary school, I did not want to be there, so I was given the reputation of troublemaker. And because I really didn't care about grades, I was also given the reputation of an idiot. This was a reputation that followed me up until the end of high school, really. The troublemaker part kind of ended at about like 8th, maybe 7th grade, and the stupid part of me was later cleared when I got to 10th grade, I believe. A bad reputation can ruin the rest of your life, and it's not very difficult to get a bad reputation, but it is excruciatingly difficult to redeem a bad reputation. But even more than that, there is the story of the whole Jean Valjean trying to escape his past. Obviously, this is something I've had to deal with being a trans woman. I'd rather move on from the past. There was some very bad things that happened at that time that I'd rather forget. I'm a completely different person now. Just like Jean Valjean when he became Madeleine. However, just like Madeleine, there are times where you have to confront that past. Unfortunately, the past never stays in the past. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions like that. But I think this brings up such a very interesting moral dilemma. I'm trying to think what in the world I would have done if I was in Jean Valjean's shoes. I probably would have sent the guy up the river, in all honesty. I mean, I'd rather live with a lifetime of guilt than go back to prison for the rest of my life. I mean, I would love to be able to have that enormous wealth and potential that Madeleine had in that town. I'll probably never will, but it's a fantastic dream. And at the same time, it was very much the kind words of the bishop, a holy man, that gave him the ability to try to turn his life around. And he did, only for it to have to be turned inside out all over again. It's a rather fascinating character study. I will admit, there are certain sections that were rather dry. Like I said, the dork that decided to leave Fantine with Cosette just wouldn't stop talking. And on top of that, there were times where the author really wanted to get descriptive. He told so many different stories about the Bishop of Digny, which I was all right with. I like the stories, but occasionally it'd just be like, oh yes, so this was the town, and this is what the shingle colors were, and there was 600 of them and 50 people. I don't need to know that. I want to know what's happening. I will admit, at first, the whole narrative bouncing around really kind of took me by surprise, because it's like, oh, okay, we got the bishop. Oh, now we got Jean Valjean. Oh, okay, now we got 4 women. Oh, we got the story of Fantine. We got the town. We got the story of Jarvet. There were so many interesting stories within the stories. I think I will end with this. I find it absolutely fascinating that War and Peace is the book that a lot of people credit for being a cinder block that is able to tackle so many characters in such a profound way. But yet, this book came out a good 6 years before War and Peace. I know people talk about the play, but come on, I feel like this is the book that needs to be studied. I will admit, I only read an abridgment of War and Peace, so I can't speak to what the whole thing would be like, but this book may have had dry spells, but that book was basically like crossing the Sahara Desert after having nothing to drink for 5 days. And the Oasis is like one character that's quickly killed off after 3 chapters, and there's also the war at the end, which surprisingly is in this book. Okay, maybe one other thing I'll mention as well is, so I first started reading this before I went on my trip to get my surgery. And it was rather fascinating as I was reading it. There were quite a few people that were talking about it. It's just like, oh, that's a pretty good book there, but I have been warned that there is a very dry section about the battlefield of Waterloo, which, from how I'm hearing it, reminds me a lot of the famous speech from Atlas Shrugged. 70 pages of what you don't need, so we'll see where that goes. I'm in part 2 right now, and, well, Victor is describing the battlefield, but it is in such a unique way that the only time I can think about such a thing happening is there was an episode of Rick and Morty, if people remember that show, where there was like interdimensional television. In one of them, the guy was advertising real fake doors. Now, ordinarily, the camera would end after where the address is, but no, the camera still follows the guy into traffic, going into his house, and the commercial picks right back up again. That is very much how this section of the book feels, because he's Victor, I could just imagine sitting there, writing the story, when all of a sudden he just kind of gets up and it's like, you know what, I'm going to go for a walk. And he's describing everything he saw on the battlefield of Waterloo. And you know, that is one of the things I very much love about Victor's style, or at least the translation of the style. I'm not sure if it's there in the original French. But it seems like there are times where he gets up from the writing desk and he just talks directly to you, the reader. It's like he just kind of nudges you and, like I said, revealing Jean Valjean. He's like, oh yeah, you realize that this is actually Jean Valjean and not Madeline, right? What? Or things where it's just kind of like, oh yes, it was around at that time. Things were crazy. But this review's getting into a bit of a runaway, and this is just part one. I can't imagine how much longer the other parts are going to be in terms of reviews, but so far, I am really loving this book. Just know it's probably going to be a while before I get to part two. Of course, I'm reading the book more consistently than I was before, but, well, look at this thing. I'm not even sure if I'm a quarter of the way through it yet. But, for all it's worth, I'm very much enjoying it. Until next time, keep having fun.